Anomalies.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Anomalies. This is a program about things seen out of the corner of one's eye, about shadows and what lurks in those shadows. This is a program about the unexplained and the unexplainable.
So Dave, here we are at another episode of Anomalies, and I think I told you that I'm actually taking a course in through the Rhein Institute, and that course is deals with hauntings, ghosts, and poltergeists. And we're really fortunate tonight to have with us my instructor, Loyd Auerbach, who I've known by reputation. And Loyd, I think I even saw you once in person if you were up here in the state of Washington. Seemed like I saw you.
I've been to Washington State and spoken a number of times over the years, yeah.
So one of those times I was in the audience. But we're really happy to have you here tonight and talk a little bit about parapsychology and some of the specifics that go with that topic. Tell us a little bit about how you got started in parapsychology, because it seems to me I heard an interview with you, and when you were in college, you were focused on astronomy initially, if I'm remembering that correctly. So
yeah,
how did you get there?
Well, I actually got involved before college. I was interested since I was a little kid because of comic books and science fiction, and started reading books by J.B. Rhein and others in parapsychology. My library had a pretty good selection, public library, and I probably when I was about 12 or 13, I was watching Dark Shadows, and that kind of sent me to the library. Mm-hmm. And I didn't realize, as I was getting into this, that I would end up in the field for sure, but it was something I was interested enough. One of my neighbors happened to know Montague Ullman. She was the mom of one of my brother's friends, and she was a yoga instructor. And Montague Ullman, who was a well-known parapsychologist, lived about 1.5 miles from us. So got to meet him. But that was all after I started a parapsychology club in my high school with the help of a couple of teachers who were interested.
Really?
So yeah, we had a parapsychology club for about 3 years. We did experiments. We were tapping into via teletype the county computer, education center computer, and could do ESP tests and other things. And I met Montague Ullman. I met Gertrude Schmeidler, another well-known parapsychologist, because of Monty Ullman, and who she also lived in the area. And it just kind of one thing fell into place after another. I went to Northwestern University, where J. Allen Hynek was the head of the astronomy department. I had gotten advice from J.B. Rhein. Actually, I'd written to him, and he said, there's no degrees in parapsychology at this time. Study whatever science, physical or social science you want. And then once you're in graduate school, then you start looking into how you can actually maneuver into the field doing graduate work. And Hynek, it just happened at Northwestern, because I was interested in astronomy. Northwestern had a great program. Hynek was the leading UFO expert, and I was interested in UFOs. But I also, when I met Hynek, when I visited the college when I was a junior in high school, it was pretty clear he knew something about parapsychology too. So that became that, and the campus itself just made me decide to go to Northwestern. However, I'll freely admit that the math got me down. And that's partly my fault and partly the fault of the math department at Northwestern. I wasn't the only one who dropped out of the astronomy, the physical sciences, and switched over to anthropology. We had some terrible teachers, terrible professors, unfortunately at the time. So I switched to anthropology, which was the absolute right thing for me to do, because when I walked into the office of the person who was going to be my advisor in that department, the anthropology professor, I was waiting for him to come back for the restroom, and on his shelves was a journal of parapsychology. So I was kind of laughing when he came in, and we had a great laugh about this, and he said, "You must be in the right place." So it was perfect, because I ended up studying cultures around the world that have beliefs in the supernatural and magic, in the paranormal. And we had a lot of courses at Northwestern, actually in the history department and also in anthro. It just prepared me for what I needed to do next. There was a a 6-week mini course at Mundelein College in Chicago, so it was pretty close, taught by John Bisaha and Brenda Dunn. Dunn went on to work with Robert John at the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, the PAIR Lab.
Mm-hmm.
So it was through that course that I found out about JFK University's parapsychology program, which had just started. So let's just say the timing has been on my side and people have been on my side. The universe has been on my side for quite some time.
Yeah, it sounds like you're in the right place for you to be.
Yeah.
One job title that you and I share is adjunct professor. I was an adjunct professor of sociology and political science for 15 years. And the reason I'm bringing that up is that when I first started teaching, particularly sociology, I was teaching in the psychology, the social and psych department, where the same department had the same chair. And I remember telling some of my psychology colleagues about my interest in not just parapsychology, but I was into Bigfoot and anything that was supernatural. And they actually, when I asked them what they thought of parapsychology, they really kind of poo-pooed it. Have you found that to be the case as far as the academic side of things? Is parapsychology more accepted now than it's ever been?
No. Actually, it was more accepted in the 60s and early 70s than after the when it started the 80s. I think it was really late 70s, beginning of the 80s is when things started going downhill in academia for parapsychology, mainly because of the organized skeptics groups, the Committee for Scientific Investigations of the Claims of the Paranormal. There were many academics who were in that group, and they have made it a toxic environment in academia for anyone to even admit, in most departments, to admit that you're interested in the subject. I knew one person who essentially his letter telling him he wasn't teaching at the university anymore. He was an adjunct professor, and he was told that he was being fired partly because of his outside interest in parapsychology. It had nothing to do with anything he was doing at the university. He had a really good lawsuit, but I think that he backed off because his wife was still working for the university at the time. They didn't want to lose that job too. But I've heard of other circumstances like that. It's worse in psychology than most other fields, honestly. Depending on whether the university has kind of some of the big name skeptics there or not. But Dean Radin did a survey of scientists in academia, I think in 2005, and it certainly hasn't gotten any better. And the ones who were most accepting of possibility of psychic functioning were quantum physicists. The ones who were least accepting were psychologists.
Yeah, the name Michael Shermer probably rings a bell with you.
Oh yeah, I've met Michael. He's not as bad as some of the others.
Right.
I think he's certainly at least a little bit more diplomatic. You know, so many of the others are followers of the late amazing Randy, and people like Penn and Teller and other people where as soon as somebody mentions something, they either tell you, if you're interested, they might actually shout you down. They might say that you're crazy, you're gullible. I've been called a whole bunch of names by skeptics, told that I'm just involved in woo-woo, and it's just ridiculous, considering that we are looking at questions of human experience.
Exactly.
And not studying them is unscientific.
What's that old mantra? The role of science is not to explain the uninvestigated; it's to investigate the unexplained. That's always resonated with me, but I don't think there are a lot of people who feel that way. Maybe a good way to proceed here would be kind of what you're doing in your class, the class I'm taking with you, which I really am enjoying. But you kind of laid out the overall dimensions of parapsychology, the three kind of divisions of parapsychology. Why don't we just go that way, and then I think that'll lead us into some other more rabbit holes here. Go ahead.
So parapsychology in the laboratory is mainly focused on, and even outside the laboratory, not as much outside the lab, but there's a focus on extrasensory perception, which is getting information without any use of the senses at all. It's perception without senses. We also look at psychokinesis, which is the idea that consciousness can directly affect and interact with matter and energy. It's called psychokinesis, action by the mind. And both of those connect to the third area. You can't really have most of the third area without those other two to some extent. That's survival of bodily death. That consciousness, human personality can survive the death of the body. And that would include things like apparitions, and it would include near-death experiences as suggestive of that, reincarnation cases, kind of things that we look at. But pretty much that exists outside the laboratory because we can't bring that kind of spontaneous phenomena into the lab, the same way that we can test for ESP and PK.
Yeah, it seems like, Dave, you had some interest in some aspects of the ESP phenomena, if I remember our conversations correctly.
Yeah.
Why don't you go ahead and...
Loyd, I'm frantically taking notes here because Loyd has already hit on about half a dozen investigators and subjects that I'm intensely interested in, and I could probably listen to him talk for 3 hours on them. But I'm going to kind of narrow it down a little bit. But okay. He mentioned the PAIR, Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab. I was fortunate enough to visit, it was at least 10 years ago. I don't know when it closed up. Do you know, Loyd, when? I mean, it's been a while.
I'm trying to remember when John retired. I mean, the skeptics made a big deal about how, the lab was closing. It was closing because Robert John was retiring. I mean,
yeah, well, and
it's like Duke University didn't kick parapsychology off campus. Rhein retired in 1965, and he restarted the lab elsewhere off campus. So,
yeah, I mean, I like to call them the pseudo-skeptics, because if you're looking at skepticism itself as a normal, healthy part of scientific investigation and observation, and that is not what they're doing, clearly. But the PAIR lab, I was fortunate enough to visit probably 15 years ago, got over to Princeton, knew somebody in New Jersey, and that's the first thing I wanted to do when I went over there. It wasn't go to New York. It wasn't, take in a Broadway show or anything. It was get to the paranormal lab. So I did visit, and it was very, very interesting, very intriguing. They had a fountain a fountain of water that they measured the height of it and the, distribution curve of its ups and downs, and tried to see if there was some influence, a mind-matter influence. So all sorts of experiments like that were great. I mean, it's just, I personally don't understand how people are not fascinated by some of these questions. But clearly, it's in a different realm, and people have to compartmentalize, and some people just can't take it on board that there may be other dimensions, there may be other ways to analyze things, that subjectivity is okay. When a pseudo-skeptic brings up you don't have a double-blind study of blah, 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 I point out that we have a legal system which is largely based on testimony. There's not always a smoking gun or OJ's glove to prove something. It's based on witness testimony, expert witness testimony. And we have plenty of expert witnesses in the parapsychological realm and any, connected realms. And if it was in a court of law, we could prove a lot of these things, but you understand.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we actually have repeatable experiments that are double blind, blind, and even more blind than that. On occasion, there have been folks from other fields that have been coerced into looking at the experiments and the controls on them and how they're set up, and they've been amazed that there's nothing wrong with the experiment. Their interpretation is not the same necessarily. Daryl Bem of Cornell University did a couple years study of precognition, and there was a huge hue and cry when a psychology mainstream journal was going to publish this and announced it. They ended up publishing. But all these mostly pseudo-skeptics or disbelievers, but many academics were slamming the journal for even putting out that they were going to publish the study without knowing whether the results of the study showed chance.
Right.
I mean, they assumed it was going to be positive, which is what it was. But Bem's people came in and they looked at Bem's control. They looked at everything. Then they looked at his statistics, and the weirdest result of this was that Daryl Bem, who's an amazing social psychologist, well known in the field of social psychology, no one could find anything wrong with his statistics. So they immediately said, well, ESP is impossible, therefore there's something wrong with this kind of statistics, with Bayesian statistics. But that put them in a double bind, because most of the social psychology and other psychology experiments use Bayesian statistics. And if there's something wrong with Bem's experiment because of that, there's something wrong with all of their experiments because of that.
Can you explain for our audience the tried and true, after examining the methodology and the structure of the experiment and not being able to find anything wrong with it, as you're describing? Can you explain the so-called file drawer effect? Is that what it's called?
Yeah, there's something where we do a huge, I'll just put this in kind of the simplest terms possible. We'll take as many experiments as we can find on a particular of a particular type. So it would be a psychokinesis experiment affecting random number generators, or remote viewing would be a good one. Taking all these remote viewing studies and compile them, you normalize certain things. This is actually a standard thing to do in psychology and other sciences, in fact. And you look to see if there's an overall effect. When you sometimes have to, you bring in the experiments that may have had no results or chance results or whatever else. Doing that, it's called a meta-analysis. Doing that with remote viewing, with the Gonsfeld studies, which is a particular methodology for ESP, with the PK, micro PK experiments, the random number generators. Doing that has shown a positive effect for each one of those after a lengthy meta-analysis. So it was suggested by one of the skeptics, well, clearly you're not including all the experiments that are out there because you're getting a positive effect. And you're leaving out, like so many, like every other, by the way, every field of science is guilty of not publishing every study. They can't.
Right.
All right. So Dean Radin, who's one of our folks, along with someone outside the field, calculated the number of chance results studies for remote viewing, for Gonsfeld, for these others, that would be necessary to bring the results of these meta-analyses to zero or to chance. And the number for any one of those, given the number of parapsychologists that have been around in the world, the number of labs or universities that were doing experiments, even private citizens doing experiments in these areas, the number of experiments would have taken the number of parapsychologists in the world and people affiliated 150 years to actually come up with that number, because there weren't enough people doing enough experiments to come up with that number.
So the skeptics said, because you're getting results that we consider to be impossible, there must be a whole army of experimenters doing experiments that get quote, bad results, and so they're hiding them. They're filing them away in the drawer, right? The file drawer effect. And Dean Radin has done a great job in his books. He's my favorite guy, in terms of what he can put in layman's terms, and he describes all the statistics, but he walks that very fine line between being a scientist and being a mystic, for lack of a better term. He's able to do that and still retain a lot of credibility, I think, on both sides. Naturally, the skeptics are going to point to him and say, blah, 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 he's whatever. But if you're fairly objective, you look at his stuff, you'll say, yeah, I mean, the guy's not crazy. He knows what he's talking about, and he explains things very well. And that's what stuck with me, is the experiments. You mentioned the Gonsfeld. Now, is that, it's been a while since I've read his book, is that the one where there's pre-sentiment?
No.
Which is the one where there's, before the image on a computer screen comes up, the observers react?
Those are called pre-sentiment experiments. That's actually what Daryl Bem did.
Okay, so what's the Gonsfeld then?
The Gonsfeld is a technique involving mild sensory deprivation, where the person who is the receiver, you have a sender and receiver. Person who's the receiver has essentially goggles on or half ping pong balls, and then there's a red or pink light that's shown on the ping pong balls or on the goggles to kind of give you an even field. So if you have your eyes open, it's like if you have your eyes closed and you're looking at and you're facing a light, we get red through our eyelids. And then the participants would wear headphones which have static going through. but there's still an experimenter who's talking to sender and receiver. The way the experiments were set up originally in an automated form in the late 70s, starting in the late 70s, by Chuck Honerton at another lab in Princeton, New Jersey, was so that the experimenter on site did not know what the targets were, did not know what the correct target was, didn't know what possible targets they were, because the computer selected everything. The sender would be shown one target, the receiver would be told over the intercom, go ahead and start, just relax your mind and get some information and start talking, and would encourage them to talk so they could take notes. And then you'd have independent judges at some point who would look at that target as well as 3 or 4 others that were randomly selected, so all mixed together, not knowing which one, and would have to actually rank the statements in that from that receiver, as well as the overall, which one do you think is the target, and what's your confidence level up to 100% that this is the target. The subject also had to do the confidence level thing with other targets as well. So it has had positive results. It's similar to remote viewing in some respects. Mm-hmm. There are many commonalities there, but the fact is that there's nothing that can be explained away here. And in fact, one of the arch pseudo-skeptics, Ray Hyman, in a fairly controversial communication back and forth, which got published in a journal, he made the statement that there was nothing wrong with the experiments. And he did say that he felt there was a communication anomaly in the data. He wouldn't go so far as to say it was ESP, but ESP is a communication anomaly. So that's a good way of putting it, I thought.
He unintentionally gave us a pretty accurate description of what's really happening.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is the case. And Ray Hyman was someone who had read most of the research, which is not something that the vast majority of people who claim to know that parapsychology has nothing to it. In fact, some of them, there was something last year on the Skeptical Inquirer's website, a couple of psychologists basically started stating the case for why ESP is impossible by first saying that they didn't bother to read the data because it's impossible.
Right.
And then they looked at several laws of physics, like the inverse square law and laws of thermodynamics, and actually got them wrong. Another skeptic, to his credit, published a review of the article who had a background in physics, and he basically took them to task for not knowing physics. So not only did they not read the data in parapsychology, they didn't understand physics.
Well, that brings up the classic statement you hear from pseudo-skeptics. I'm not aware of any evidence for X, right. Y, Z. Well, you're not aware because you haven't read a single
I'm looking
thing.
For it. Yeah.
You haven't exhibited any objectivity about any of this. The amazing, in quotes, Randy was, the guy didn't have a scientific degree, right?
Oh, he had no background in science.
He was a magician. That's all he was. And yet he
was fairly knowledgeable, but I don't think he was a very good magician.
Well, anyone can become knowledgeable. I don't have I have a master's degree in business. I know statistics, but that doesn't mean I know physics. However, I can learn from reading many, many books, dozens of books from experts. I can learn about these issues, and I can make an informed decision about what's likely or where to go for further information. But you don't hear that from the pseudo skeptics. And my last thing, I'll let Dan get in here because I know he's got a lot of paranormal type questions. I tend to be the scientific guy, the stats guy, the one who wants to hear about the studies and the backgrounds of the researchers and all that. But that gets a tad dry. I mean, for a show like this, at least. But you mentioned somewhere around the 70s and 80s, things kind of went awry. I tend to pin that on Carl Sagan personally. People have said I've got a vendetta against him, which is probably not far from the truth.
I actually think Sagan had something to do with it because he's such a public face of science. But really, Randy was responsible for so much more of this.
Yeah.
And, Sagan actually, even in his book, one of his books, made the statement that there were 3 things in parapsychology that were worthy of study. One of them was the Ganzfeld. Mm-hmm. I can't remember what the third was, but the second one was children who remember previous lives.
Yeah, I think I do remember.
Yeah, and really, I have friends in the field who are pure materialists. They don't believe in life after death, survival of death. They interpret the evidence in a different way with ESP and other psychic phenomena, rather than saying that it's really consciousness surviving death. But they look at those cases. One of them in particular looks at those cases and said, "There's something really interesting going on here. This should really be studied more." Now, his background's not in the area that would be appropriate for him to study it, but he's fully admitted that it's got him scratching his head, whether it's there's no psychic explanation he can think of. There's no, materialist explanation he can think of. So the fact that you have these cases where children do remember previous lives, and there's really clear evidence that there is no tampering of information, that these kids haven't been fed information, it's really clear. I mean, you can really look at some of these cases and find that out. And that they're just simply sloughed off. I think it's partly because of religious interpretation, or I guess you could say bias against the idea of reincarnation in Christianity and a lot of other mainstream religions. Even though early Christians believed and taught reincarnation at the beginning. There's also the pop culture, making fun of reincarnation in so many different ways because of cross-cultural stuff. But what if it's not reincarnation? What if there's something, if it's not reincarnation? Let's put that aside for a minute. There's something amazingly interesting going on with these kids that could say so much about who we are as human beings and how we develop. That is amazingly, to me, it's incredibly unscientific to not even question what's going on.
Yeah, for sure. And the idea that there's nothing after death, to me, is ludicrous just on its face, because what is nothing? We don't know. There's nothing that is nothing in science.
Well, except that when you're under deep anesthesia, you don't have any conscious thought, and you may not even have any unconscious thought.
Right.
So
some people do.
Of death in that sense.
Some people do, though, have thought when they're under anesthesia. They're under, induced coma or something, where they don't have any brain activity, or their heart has been stopped for 45 minutes or whatever. But getting into the near-death experience.
Yeah, the near-death experience is that's a really interesting piece. That there are people who are pseudo-skeptics or disbelievers who are studying that. And every year it seems like one of them or a group of them come up with the explanation for near-death experiences, which covers a small percentage of them, but it doesn't cover the classic ones, which are a good look at them.
Yeah, well, go ahead, Dan. You got a bunch of stuff. I know you want.
Well, no, Dave, you're doing a great job. I wanted to comment about the series that Loyd appeared in, the Surviving Death series on Netflix. I think that's just outstanding. Raises a lot of interesting questions. One thing I was thinking about as I was listening to you guys talk is from the psychokinetic side of things. So I was thinking of people like Uri Geller, who can bend spoons, and even the people in the Philippines who do psychic healings. It seems like some of that stuff is documentable, but is it really understandable? And maybe that's not the focus of science. So how would you respond to that, Loyd? Understand?
We call that macro PK because you can see it happening. Psychokinesis is a tough thing. I worked with someone who could do movement of objects for quite some time, and had he survived the cancer that was misdiagnosed and diagnosed too late, we would be working with him today. His name was Martin Caden. He was a well-known science fiction and science and aviation writer, and in fact wrote the book that created the $6 Million Man. He was also a consultant to NASA. I mean, he was really well respected. And Marty could do stuff. He could move things under really controlled conditions. The issue that with macro PK, though, honestly, is it can be faked if you're not careful. Uri Geller is an entertainer. I interviewed Uri for Japanese TV years and years ago at his house in England. And one of the questions they wanted me to ask, which I did, is, "Are you a psychic?" And he said, he was very dodgy. He basically said, "No, I'm not a psychic. Everyone has psychic ability. I'm an entertainer," which is how he actually got his start. So he does do magic. He also does appear to actually have legitimate abilities, but just not 100% of the time. So I can't fault him for being an entertainer and using trickery if he needs to, because one day he can't bend spoons psychically. A couple of my magician buddies over the years, I actually have a parallel career in magic and mental.
Right, I know.
Heavily involved in psychic entertainment, the Psychic Entertainers Association. And, I know people who are some of the best metal benders in the world or best magicians in the world who were baffled when Geller, one of them in particular who died a few years ago, brought his own spoon from the US, knew he was meeting Geller. They met at a pub after a lecture that Geller gave. Barry held the spoon in his hand while Geller just stroked it very briefly, and it bent in Barry's hand, and it was the spoon that he brought with him. Geller had never had full control of it at any time. There were other magicians there who saw the whole thing too. So, Barry was baffled. He says, "How do you do that?" And I said, well, there's really only one way, unless he has some kind of super chemical that nobody knows about. So you have a problem with performance with psychokinesis, that it's almost an athletic performance. You're asking someone to possibly hit a home run every time. And they might
They're not going to do that.
No athlete can do that. Yeah. It's not human. It's not our normal performance for that. And there's fear of psychokinesis. Just generally, people have a fear of witnessing it. They see something move. I've taught people to move stuff. We use the method that Martin Caidin came up with. It's in my book, Mind Over Matter, in fact. And we've taught people over the years to move things. But when I've done these PK workshops, sometimes the people, as soon as something starts moving in front of them that they've been taught to teach, I teach them how to move it, they freak out. They just back up for a minute. It's like, did I do that? It's like, yeah, you can do it again. No, I don't want to do that again. And yet they came to the workshop to learn how to do that.
You brought up a great point that I think needs to kind of be reiterated here, and that's that the temptation is large for someone who does have these abilities to for lack of a better term, fake it, because obviously if you're a performer, you need to be on all the time, right? But even if you weren't, you'd feel the need to prove what you know that you can already do, but you think that the audience isn't going to believe it unless you do it on demand, which again, as you say, Loyd, is ridiculous because athletes can't. You stand at the free throw line and some days you shoot 50%, even though your average is 80%. And it's just not a human thing to do things on demand. And the other side of that, I think, is that the people who can do, say, the CDs, is it in India, the magical powers, the special powers that one can learn to achieve with a certain level of meditation and so on, the gurus, part of the unwritten code, maybe it's written somewhere, is that you do not show off these powers, right? So even if you're able to do them, it's part of the code to not let yourself become part of a scientific experiment or a public demonstration or something that in one way or another is showing off these abilities. So you've got people who have temptation to fake them, but then you also have genuine practitioners who are very hesitant to prove it, in quotes again, to science. So you got both ends of the spectrum here, but both of them working against what scientists would require to prove something like this. So it's kind of a double-edged sword there also. Do you think that's accurate?
I think that's accurate. I think there's some people in that circumstance. I think there is a fear, not only a fear of psychokinesis, but if you were someone who was able to produce it on, relatively on demand and weren't doing it in the right context, as a healer, for example, you can pretty much get away with it in a lot of places for that. But or as a performer, like Geller was doing, the problem then is, there's this idea, and we hear this idea about, in movies and TV all the time. Don't let the government find out you can do this because they're going to snag you up and try to dissect you in a lab. The ETs are going to they have to hide because the government's. It's like I like to know what part of the government is swift enough to be able to do that.
Right.
People talk about the government as if it's some singly minded able to do things easily there are groups within the government, but there are also more groups in private sector who are more likely to do that for nefarious reasons, I think, than in the government. But there's a fear of that. People already have reacted throughout history to anyone who demonstrates psychic ability, that they're witches, they're sorcerers, they're evil, they're wrong. There are religions, mainstream religions, who would say that, and I've been told this myself, that I am doing the devil's work by studying.
I bet you have.
So, which doesn't bother me because I never believe in the devil. I'm Jewish, so no devil.
One of the things about the nature of our shows, and maybe just who we hang out with a lot of people who claim to be psychics, particularly mediums. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that they continually tell me, and I'm sure Dave has been told this, is everybody can do what we do. So talk about that. Can everybody do what? Is everybody psychic, and to what degree?
Yeah, and actually I'm in the middle of teaching a psychic development course for the Rhein Center. You're taking the field investigations class. I also have a developing intuition course, which we offer every so often. And Geller was right. I mean, one of the ththings I have to say that Geller's superpower that I've seen over and over again is being able to motivate other people to do what he claims to be able to do. He convinces people that they can bend stuff. He convinces people that they can do things. He's an amazingly psychic motivator in that way. And he's always contended from the very moment he appeared in the United States, and I think even in Israel, that everyone has this ability, that everyone has the aptitude to do psychic things. And that's what Rhein felt. The Rheins, when they started their work in the 1930s, felt that ESP was distributed in the population. The problem being that our culture, religion, family, and education are all impinging upon us as kids, so we may not grow up to be psychic, or we don't really lose them biologically, we lose them
sociologically, probably
belief-wise and socially. Yeah. So there's two sides to this, because it's not likely everyone can be as psychic as everyone else. One of the things that I've learned from the psychics and mediums I've worked with is that we may all have some psychic ability there, but we have to figure out what kind of psychic ability, because there's different applications. Just like in art, people have an aptitude for painting a certain way, or drawing, or sculpting, or in music, you may have an aptitude for percussion instruments, or for writing music, or for playing the piano, but you may not be able to do you can't do everything, in other words. And that seems to be the case for human beings in general when it comes to psychic phenomena. So we have people go through different things. I work with a Japanese medium on multiple Tokyo Broadcasting System programs here in the States. That's how I got to meet Geller, actually. But we would normally go to a location that was haunted with her, and then we'd also do an experiment with her. And each experiment for each show, we did different kinds of experiments with her. And she knew what she could do. In other words, she was a medium. She could talk to the dead. She could pick up information from time to time from clothing. She actually helped with some murder investigations. So she could do psychometry. She didn't know about anything else, because she never tried remote viewing. So we did a remote viewing experiment. She never tried psychokinesis. So we did that. And she was perfectly so ego uninvolved that she didn't do well. She said, oh, can't do that. Let's move on to the next thing. Let's see what else I can do. And that's the way it should be, is that people get freaked out if they can't do one thing, when in fact, that may be not the right way to use your psychic ability. You have to figure out the right application. And once you do that, you may be able to get really, really, really good.
Let's turn toward the afterlife experiences, which is something that probably draws all of us. I thought it was interesting, the comments you made in the class about ghost hunting groups. You had some student who did a survey of ghost hunting groups in the United States. There were like 3,000 of them.
She stopped at around 3,000, yeah. These were actual active websites in the U.S. for ghost hunting.
So I'm guilty of having been part of that 3,000 a couple different times in my life. And as I look back on that experience, First of all, I don't think we really did anything scientific, even though we had a bunch of gadgets and we somehow convinced ourselves that an EMF meter was a way to measure some kind of spirit activity rather than check out the electrical functioning of your house. So, comment about ghost hunting groups. What's wrong with them? Are there good ones? The two groups I was in, they didn't last over three or 4 years. It's like the group dynamics totally fell apart. So maybe talk a little bit about what you know about ghost hunting groups.
Sure. I'm very critical of the so-called paranormal community and ghost hunting groups. And what it boils down to is that too many of them follow methods that they're watching on TV as if those are actual methods. Mm-hmm. They're taking, even I think even Jason and Graham from Ghost Hunters at one point, at one conference I went to, that they were speaking, they mentioned that they had shot like 35 hours of video and it ends up as 22 minutes on TV. And that's normal. I mean, that's what happens. And to take that 22 minutes and base your investigative process on something that not only do the people involved, even if they know what they're doing, not only is that a good reflection of what they were doing, because they have no input in the final product. That's being edited by someone with them not in the room, telling them how to edit it. Edited for ratings, edited for entertainment, edited for conflict. So the shows that are out there, people are following methods that are not created by even knowledgeable ghost hunters. They're following methods that are tampered with, tinkered with, and sometimes created out of whole cloth by TV producers who know nothing about the field whatsoever. So, and I know a lot of this from having been in television on shows, so many shows over the years, worked in production a little bit here and there. My dad was a producer for NBC. I grew up in the TV industry. So, at NBC in New York. I grew up at 30 Rock practically. I can say that was like my second home in some respects. So it's, when you do that, and then there's the idea that it's not scripted, they're not being told what to say, that's absolutely untrue. In fact, I got cut out of a couple of shows because I refused to say what the director wanted me to say, because it wasn't true. It wasn't what I would come out of my mouth ever. Had nothing to do with anything that was going on. So they're directed. They're told to say it again, do it again, say it smaller, say it longer. Act surprised, act frightened. If you base stuff on that, then you know what? You ought to go into law enforcement, but your training should all be the TV show Cops. That's it. That's all you need, right? It's just watching that show, because obviously that covers everything cops need to know. Right. It's an absurd thing, and unfortunately, it's not only an American thing. It's something that we see, and there's also a lack of science education in this country. There has been for a long time, because the real problem is that on these shows, they talk about these gadgets actually detecting ghosts or detecting that or communicating. And that's not the intention of most of the devices. They're not built for that. We have no idea how to detect a ghost at all, other than human beings. So thinking about this, you've heard this in the class, that unless we have a human witness or human report, which is how we define a ghost or an apparition anyway, it's someone saw or experienced something that's somebody that seems to be sticking around after death. Poltergeist phenomena is about witnessed things moving around. You don't have any witnesses? What do you got? And some of the shows will completely throw out witnesses altogether. So it's a lack of understanding of the gadgetry. It's an assumption, because it seems to be that's what they're saying on TV, that using these devices means you're being scientific, because they say they are. Not. It's not questioning whether the manufacturers of some of the ghost boxes are actually making things that can do what they say they do, and how do you know that they can do that? So a lot of questions, and unfortunately, too many of these folks don't. It's certainly not everybody. There's some good people out there, but a lot of them get bored with the groups that they end up joining, which is good. I'm always glad to hear that. They're bored of sitting in the dark and waiting for somebody to get a recording.
When somebody once asked me about belonging to a ghost hunting group, they said, what's the best thing and the worst thing about it? And I said, belonging to the group, because that was both the best thing and the worst thing. Right. I don't know, difficult. So why don't you differentiate for people between apparitions, poltergeists, and hauntings? I think that would be a good instructive point to make at this juncture.
So first, most people, when they say the word ghost, there's an implicit, in our culture, implicit idea that this is someone who died and you're seeing somebody after their death. We use the word apparition typically for someone who has passed away, who's died, and is still apparently around and interacting. So apparitions are interactive. People are interactive, most people. Even if they yell at you, they're still interactive. Whereas a haunting, which on TV, they use that term correctly most of the time, but they usually use the phrase residual haunting. And I think there's something to that in the sense that we're talking about places. So the word haunt refers to a place. My old haunts are the places I've been to again and again and again. We see that in old detective movies too. People who are regulars at bars and restaurants, they're haunting that restaurant. So that's when we're alive, of course. We seem to leave impressions behind. We seem to leave emotions behind. We seem to have our actions sometimes recorded into the environment on one level or another. And then other people, living people, can pick up those recordings, get that information, and replay it in their heads unconsciously. It just kind of comes through. So sometimes the ghost that people see, the figure that people are seeing, or the activity that they're seeing, or the sounds that they're hearing, which are not really sounds, are because that witness, that person, is having a psychic experience and picking up the information in the environment. And these things the recordings, as we can call them, have nothing to do with the dead at all. They have everything to do with living people. Living people make these recordings. We leave impressions behind. We leave the information behind. We leave our emotions behind. We may die before anybody experiences that as a haunting, just like Humphrey Bogart made a lot of movies, but he's dead now and I can still watch his movies. They're just recordings. It doesn't mean that he died before he made them. So it's the same kind of thing with a haunting. So think of it as a psychic movie that you can sometimes pick up on. So
before you go to the next point, and before I forget, I wanted to interject here the idea of the Akashic record. Is that, I'm sure you're familiar with that term, is that what you're implying here, or is that something that you'd...
No, I mean, the idea of the Akashic records is that there's some dimension or something that captures every bit of information ever, and that some psychics can tap into that. And this is a very localized phenomenon. We call it sometimes even place memory.
Okay, so it's not a tapping into a universal mind or a library of sorts necessarily.
If it is, it's a very weird way of tapping in, because those recordings are perceived or seen, experienced by someone, by different people the exact same way.
Right.
So somebody would have to have the book out from the Akashic records.
Okay, so that there is a difference there. That's a fairly subtle distinction, but yes, I understand what you're saying. So the other aspect that Dan wanted you to describe.
Poltergeist, yeah.
Poltergeist.
Yeah. So, that term is used slightly differently in different parts of the world. The original term was applied to cases, the same kind of cases we would apply to it today, which is cases that involve physical activity. Whether it has been in the past applied, whether there's a ghost scene or not. The word poltergeist, which was coined as far as historians have seen in the 16th century in Germany, there's some information that indicates that Martin Luther himself may have actually used that term first. But that was applied to cases mainly with physical activity. Not most ghost cases, apparitional or haunting experiences don't have any physical activity. But poltergeist cases have physical activity. And in fact, in the US, we use that term to describe those cases that have physical activity where there's no indication of any spirit, apparition, or anything else. So purely physical activity. And that could be moving objects, breaking objects, flying objects. It could be technology screwing up in the weirdest ways, things appearing and disappearing. There's a variation of what could happen. Water appearing from nowhere, that kind of thing. In the UK, and I actually only learned this a few years ago in conversing with one of my colleagues online who was there. The UK will use the term poltergeist to describe any case in which there is physical activity whether it's apparently from a spirit or apparition, so that whether there's an apparition there or not. Whereas here, we do have cases where apparitions seem to be able to move things, but we attribute that to the apparition, not to the situation. So our poltergeist cases, the way we use that term is this kind of the second level for the Brits, where we track it back to a living person in the environment causing the activity unconsciously. And it's psychokinesis, it's mind over matter. It's a telekinetic temper tantrum. Kind of like, I think the stereotypical version of this would be Stephen King's book and movie, the first version of the movie Carrie.
Carrie. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the teenage girl, which is, it's not always a teenager, by the way. That's counts for about 60%. But I've had cases with a couple poltergeistations. One was in her 70s, another one was in her 80s. And it's also not always females. So,
on a previous show, we had Barry Taff on as a guest. I'm sure you know about him. And one of the things that surprised me about what Barry was talking about, and I think he was referring to that famous case, The Entity, that a movie was made about, but I think he was talking in general. He felt that most reportings of ghosts were actually poltergeist phenomena, and they were not apparitions or hauntings.
Yeah,
what would you say to that?
Barry and I disagree about life after death. I mean, Barry doesn't necessarily go that way. He tends to fall into some other potential psychic explanations that these are psychic projections. But we have cases that do not involve any physical activity at all and can take place over decades with different witnesses kind of communicating, not knowing that they're communicating with the same ghost until you really look at the whole case across multiple decades. It just doesn't fit the model of poltergeist, especially since poltergeists relate to a living person causing this kind of activity. And the living people change over time. So that really doesn't make sense. The entity case, nothing like, really not like the movie. I mean, I'm sure Barry talked about that, and talked about the kind of liberties they took with the film, and even the book. Frank DiFilippo, who wrote the novel based on the case. The case was investigated by Barry Taff and Carrie Gaynor, and it was a poltergeist case, but it has some really unique features in the sense that besides physical activity, the woman's claims that she was being physically attacked, and I had a case like that. Not sexually attacked, but a woman was claiming to be physically attacked, and she had an attack in front of us, but we were able to very quickly through the interview process figure out her psychological issue that was causing her own mind to attack her body in many respects. And in the entity case, they had these bursts of light that they even photographed that were witnessed by many people, and that kind of electrostatic or plasma effect has been reported in the past. And it's not outside the range of what psychokinesis can do. But it was the woman herself who was causing all this activity, not an outside entity.
Talk about some of the more interesting cases that you've investigated over your years of particularly looking into hauntings, apparitions, and poltergeists. I'm sure our audience would be interested in hearing your stories.
I can give you a couple of, I guess, the Cliff Notes versions of a couple of them.
Sure.
So I had one case which was early in my career, a very odd haunting. The couple was reporting they moved into this house was less than 6 years old, one set of previous owners, another couple that moved out of the Westchester County area, Upper Westchester, down to Manhattan. And when they moved into the house, there were two master suites upstairs, and they were woken up every night, they claimed, by the sounds of two people, as it turned out, making love very loudly in the next room. And they'd walk out and they'd go in the other room and there's nobody there. This was a detached house. The windows were closed. And this would go on every night except for Sunday night to Monday morning. So apparently there was a night of rest for whatever was going on. So in the process of interviewing and talking to them, finding out a bit about the previous owners, I did some research on the area to make sure there wasn't anything that had been standing there before, any previous structures or anything like that. The development was less than 7 years old at the time. And it came down to a couple of things. One, that they didn't hear the sounds if they walked into the room themselves. They only heard it from outside the room. They actually learned how to turn it off by moving into that room. It was a repetitive pattern that never changed, except And this got to be a little bit embarrassing for the husband, but very amusing for the wife. She would sometimes talk about them waiting to see how long it went. And apparently it went for 25 minutes at one point before he got pissed off and got up and turned it off by walking into the other room.
That's enough.
They were having problems with their sex life, it turned out. I actually talked to the previous owner. I got the phone number from a neighbor. I called him up like after the weekend that I had spent some time at the house, and I started talking to him about the house. The couple had some questions because they're having these weird experiences, and he got freaked out because he thought they were trying to get out of the sale 6 months later by saying the house was haunted. And I then said to him, hey, what does 3 o'clock in the morning mean to you and your wife? And there was dead silence. And then he said, well, I can't tell you exactly why, because it's a long story. But yeah, we would get up in the middle of the night and make love. And I guess we were kind of loud sometimes. So they were leaving an impression behind. They left that imprint behind. There are ways to deal with how to get rid of those. As it turned out, the thing the wife decided was to move their bed into that room so they wouldn't hear anything, since they never heard anything in that room. But apparently it charged up their sex life. So, yeah. So that was a positive outcome. I never found, I should have checked years later to find out if they ever sold their house, because I really worry about the next family that moved in. And then I had this one case, which is actually written up in the book that's the TV series Surviving Death, the Netflix series is based on. The Netflix series is based on a book called Surviving Death by Leslie Kean, K-E-A-N, Kean. And she asked me to contribute a chapter on apparitions to that. So I did, explaining them and explaining a case that I had, which involved a family that had bought an old house in Livermore, California, and they got it in an estate sale because the previous owner had died of cancer in the hospital and had only one living relative who, at the time they bought the house, was 90 and living somewhere. They actually did it all through an attorney. They never met the guy. Never even got a chance to talk to him until after we discovered what was going on. But a year and a half in, the boy, who was 12 at that time, starts talking about seeing the ghost and talking to this ghost, and then saying flat out, and I'm talking to the ghost, Lois. And the mother got very, she was a lawyer, so she backed off a little bit and said, well, how do you know? And he said, Mom, the ghost, Lois, the ghost that you and Dad and Grandma are seeing, Bar and talking about. And it turned out that every member of the family had been seeing this woman on a fairly regular basis. They didn't talk to her, but they had seen her since they moved in and just weren't admitting it to anybody else because they're afraid of the reaction of the rest of the family. So we actually got taken on a tour of the house by the kid, and nobody, but he said she was standing there and walking around with us. We sat down and interviewed him, or I should say we interviewed her through him. We actually talked to an empty chair. It was like right out of a movie. We're talking to an empty chair and the kid's telling us what she's saying. He's translating. And some of it was stuff I wrote. I just immediately said, I'm not even going to count this. It was about the history of Livermore, because the woman had been born there in the early 20th, very early 20th century, lived in the house all her life. And he could have learned anything about the history of Livermore, any number of places. But then she gave family stories through him. That was one piece of it. She also addressed questions that I asked about, what happened when you died, what was the process, what was going on. How come he can see, when he sees you sometimes in different clothing every day, at slightly different ages, something we know from other ghost cases. And she had good answers for that, or he did. And these would have been very hard for him to find anywhere in the media in the 1985 time frame. There were no videotapes that addressed this, and there were only a couple of books that even addressed this that were still in print. He wouldn't have been able to find. So I also then got the information about the only living relative of this woman. And when I called to speak to him, initially I couldn't get through because he was 92 at the time. But when he heard that this was in relation to his cousin Lois and her ghost, he was immediately interested because he was 92. And I would start these stories that Chris told me, the boy told me, and he would finish them. So purposely, she apparently told stories to him to relay to me. There were ones that he not only knew, but he was part of sometimes. So this was kind of a clincher, especially when I said, well, you got any questions for us? There were some goofy questions about Ghostbusters. the movie, which really may have come from him as much as from her. But then there was a question of each of us, myself and the two other people I was with, that directly related to the conversation that we had on the drive, the 40-minute drive from the university to Livermore, the house in Livermore. And unless they had bugged my car, or the kid was extremely reading our minds literally, there was no explanation. So when I said to him, "How does she know this?" He said, "Well, she watches TV with me. She saw commercials for Ghostbusters. I saw Ghostbusters. She was kind of afraid, so she got you your car at the university and she hitched a ride." So,
what is your
idea if that really happened, but
what is your speculation about where these entities or these thought forms or whatever you want to call them, where do they reside? Are there different levels of reality, so to speak?
Yeah, what's the afterlife all about? That's a typical question.
That's a problem, because the ghosts that we talk to haven't gone to the afterlife.
Right.
They're still here.
They're still here. Yeah.
What's your theory about that? Are they trapped? Do they unfinished business? Do they not know they're dead? Those sorts of things.
You've hit three possible
Right.
three things.
I want to know your.
If there's honestly no one size fits all here
Right.
at all. There are those that are in denial that they're dead. There are those that, in Lois's case, she told us that she was afraid of the afterlife. She hadn't been religious, didn't know if there was a heaven or hell and where she'd end up. So she figured, let me just go home and see if there's a nice family that moves into the house. So you could say that she's stuck because she stuck herself there. We stick around only in those circumstances where there's a reason for us to stick around. It's usually our reason. Although sometimes we hear from some of these spirits through psychics or mediums that the reason they're there is they're staying with their family. Actually, they stick around with their family. And that's because the family doesn't want to let them go. The family's still in grief, so they're there trying to watch over their family. In the meantime, the family, because they're grieving, the person can't leave.
But is it really the person, though, or is it the family generating the entity? I mean, it's so confusing.
Everything we hear from mediums in that circumstance is it's empathy for the family that's in grief that prevents them from going.
Now, you mentioned quite a while ago the role that emotion plays in hauntings, and maybe a lot of this type of paranormal parapsychology. There's something about emotion, human emotion, that gives energy or draws energy from somewhere or opens doors to somewhere. What's your speculation about what role energy or emotion plays?
Well, emotion definitely has a role with psychic functioning, because when people do well psychically, unless they're training themselves in other ways, such as in the remote viewing process, emotion on a spontaneous basis for people to be psychic with each other or with events, with other things, there's always an emotional piece to it. And when you say emotion, it could be any emotion.
Yeah.
As that meaning or piece to it. The hauntings, we leave emotions behind as recordings more than anything else. And you can think of it as the vibes you feel when you go house hunting. How does that place feel? Sometimes it's the decor, and sometimes there's a smell, but usually it's something we feel. And I've talked to realtors over the years, and I've talked to many people, and everybody I know has had an experience. I had that experience. We've had experience looking around for homes to rent. Originally, my wife first moved up to the Bay Area before we got married, and when we bought a house, how does it feel? And people do things that way because we're leaving that recording behind, that emotion behind. And we're not sure of the mechanism at this point. We're still trying to figure that out. And it's really hard to figure it out for the hauntings because there's no research money at all supporting that. So there are things that some of us would like to try, which would take very little, but there's only one foundation that's even offering grants at this point. So.
And which foundation is that?
That's BIAL, BIAL, and they don't typically fund research outside the lab.
Now, are you familiar with the society SSE?
Sure, the Society for Scientific Exploration. Yeah, I'm a member.
Exploration, right. Yes, I assumed that with the journal, the JSE, which is very interesting. I think I recommend everyone get on that mailing list. Does that organization fund
No.
Any investigation?
No, I mean, I know that some organizations have a little bit of money for students, funding a student project or something.
Mm-hmm.
The Parapsychology Foundation has a couple of awards that they give, but they're under $5,000.
Are you familiar with the name Robert Bigelow?
Yeah, and I know about the Bigelow Challenge that's out there right now. That's a big chunk of money.
Oh, is that a way to get some funding?
Some of us are going to try. I'm working with a couple others for the Rhein Center on behalf of the Rhein Center. But that challenge, which I've been asked by so many people about that at this point. The idea of having to come up with some enough evidence to prove life after death, when we really can't be sure until we get there, it's about acceptance of the evidence.
Mm-hmm.
It's about the preponderance, because we have a preponderance of evidence if you don't look at it from a purely materialistic perspective. The problem is that and one of the reasons why there are so many people who don't believe in life after death is because many people believe that we are just a brain and we're like meat robots and that's it. And if that's your philosophy, if that's what you're coming from, I completely understand why you can't accept any of this stuff. I mean, I do understand that. But you should be open to other interpretations as well. Gertrude Schmeidler, one of our luminaries in our field, and I'm paraphrasing here, once said, life after death, or the afterlife, is the only one of our phenomena that we will not know if we're wrong.
Huh.
We'll only know if we're right when we get there.
Mm-hmm.
Mm. But part of the problem, the big problem with these, didn't Randy have what was his challenge called?
Originally it was $10,000, then it was $1 million.
Then it was $1 million, but in
Yeah.
Bigelow, I assume, I haven't looked in depth at Bigelow thing because, like you said,
Bigelow's not basing this on, or they're not basing, they do have judges, and they're not basing this on performing something, which is what Randy's challenge was.
Well, and Randy's was likely impossible no matter what, because there was no criteria. There were no criteria laid out in the beginning. I'm just wondering if Bigelow is any different at all, or is he just saying, "I'll give you $500,000 if you convince me"? I mean, that's
I don't know. I mean, we have to look at there's some fairly well-known people who are the judges. One of them is Leslie Keene, in fact.
right.
Colm Kelleher from the Skinwalker Ranch project.
That's who Bigelow is. Yeah. I mean, the problem is that even if the judges point to this essay or that essay as the winner, Bigelow probably still has the right of first refusal to that.
Well, and what I have heard too is it's really driven by the fact that Bigelow lost a son.
Yes.
And he's trying to establish some kind of contact with him. So that might affect the outcome.
I mean, this is not the right way to establish contact, but this is the right way to, I think that having people collect all this evidence, as long as the evidence is not buried by Bigelow later on, as long as people do in fact keep the copyright, because it's going to, there are 3 prize winners, but everybody else, there'd be a lot of other people submitting, and there could be some really good work that comes out here that when you put it all together could be a really, really amazing case for what's going on. But if you take things singly, they may not be as good. And again, it's dependent on Bigelow himself. I mean, if he wants to communicate, there are some great mediums out there who've gone through research process, who have been verified in so many different ways, as best as we could, and would likely be able to do that. That's not what he's looking for. I think he just wants to know that his son is there, and he wants more than personal experience for that.
So talking about mediums for a second, it seems like to me one of the organizations you're affiliated with screens or vets mediums.
Right.
Is that the Family Forever?
Forever Family Foundation, yes. Forever Family Foundation, we have a certification process. We just started it back up. We had to modify it for COVID. And it's a process of scoring, again, independent judging type thing for the statements that mediums make, looking to certify them as evidential mediums, but also we go through a vetting process, it's an interview process to make sure that they're doing it for the right reason, that they have to participate as actually volunteers. We're a nonprofit, all volunteer organization. No one makes any money from this, not directly anyway. The mediums make money because they make money as mediums once they're certified, but they also have to volunteer at we have grief retreats, one of which was featured in the series.
Right.
We're hoping to do another conference next year in 2022. We're doing some other things as well, and they offered their services to us as fundraisers also, with no strings attached. So that's part of it as well, to the community and to the organization. And we support the work of mediums specifically in the family grieving process, as well as supporting the work of researchers who do research in life after death.
Someone recently told me about, of course, I'm familiar generally with seances and what mediums do, but they told me about a series of experiments using mediums in England called the skull experiments.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, that's
what do you know about that?
There's a couple of books on the subject. I'm in one of the documentaries about the skull experiments. It was an experiment conducted by scientists. It's physical mediumship. It's not the same as we don't deal with physical mediums in the foundation, because physical mediumship doesn't really give you personal connection at all. Physical mediumship is supposedly the spirits working through one or more individuals cause physical activity, which then shows that the afterlife is real. And that in itself is questionable, honestly.
Controversial.
There has to be information that comes through in some way, shape, or form, because otherwise, how do you know it's not the psychokinesis of the medium? Mm-hmm. They don't even know that they're doing it. So it's touchy. The skull experiments were done in really good conditions by some smart people. They got some really interesting activity. They did have communication from other scientists supposedly on the other side. So it's really kind of an interesting thing. But there's, you can only go as far as, personally, I know of these people. I don't suspect anybody of fraud for those experiments whatsoever, different in other circumstances. But that's as far as you can take it, because it was all done in the dark, so you have to look at the information. And if the information's not information that can be, that's valuable, it really doesn't make much difference in some respects.
I guess that's true with any kind of a seance, is that there's a certain amount of credibility that is in doubt or not in doubt, depending on who's running the seance.
The fact is the word seance refers to spirit communication, a communication session. And we're now stuck with the pop culture version of a seance, which is either people around a table with candles holding their hands, or it's in complete darkness. And none of the mediums I know, the evidential mediums, would ever work in the dark. They don't like dark. We work in, they work in full light in the middle of the day, at lunchtime, morning for breakfast, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. Because the spirit world doesn't need darkness, according to them.
Mm-hmm. Dave, did you have anything else you wanted to talk to Loyd about?
No,
I'm watching our time here. We've got about 10 minutes.
I'm torn. I admitted before that I'm a numbers guy. I'm torn because the ghost things to me are just so subjective. I can't really wrap my head around it. So I tend to look at something like the Global Consciousness Project, which I'm sure Loyd is familiar with, the eggs, the random number generators, the network around the world, that I think it's well established that they do deviate from pure chance, from randomness, depending. However, this is where this gets subjective too. And so I'm always searching for, when there's a worldwide event, however you just define that, a very emotional event, say 9/11, when everyone was watching TV at that time, it makes sense that you would get a disturbance in the force, so to speak, which would cause these random number generators to diverge from randomness.
Well, the thing to do, which is what Roger Nelson intended to do, was pick events that are going to happen. And those would be events, that's like the World Soccer match and the Super Bowl. Highly emotionally charged events.
And again, emotion, yes, plays into it.
And affect millions of people.
So how do you feel about that project? Do you think it's been successful? Is it?
I think it absolutely shows there's something there. One of my colleagues who actually does PK research feels that Roger Nelson's doing it all himself.
Doing what?
Causing all the effects himself.
Well, that's
because he really wants it to happen.
Which would also be interesting in itself, right?
Of course, yeah. If Roger's doing that, we need to talk about taking him to Vegas.
Kidding.
But
as Radin pointed out, though, there's a what was his phrase? I used to know it by heart. A weak, an accumulation, a very weak correlation, whatever it is.
Yeah, it's weak effects. I mean, the effects are not major. They're very weak effects. Yeah, the effects on computers and such are happening at a very low level of size, and that's different than physically moving an object. The problem, there seems to be less of an issue with affecting computers and such, affecting random number generators, because we don't see the effect. We don't, there's no fear there from people. And the fear factor, not so much, ESP is not as bad as PK, although honestly, a lot of the pseudo-skeptics are terrified that if ESP were real, that everybody could read their deep, dark secrits. Yeah. And I've had several of them tell me that, in fact. Yeah. And that's not, I actually talked to one guy who was so afraid that if they acknowledged that ESP was a real thing, that somehow overnight everyone could read everybody else's mind just by the fact of that announcement. And it's like, well, I basically thought he was an idiot. But
there's a deep running fear, and that's quite a roadblock to
it's a roadblock. It's a roadblock to performance. Personal performance. This is what sports psychology is all about, is helping athletes get past their fear for performance and their doubt, and really accessing what they can access. And a lot of, when we talk about psychokinesis, honestly, we should be working with sports psychologists, because that's what's going on. It's performance, a physical performance.
So can you name, say, 2 or 3 avenues of research that you think show the most promise in terms of kind of turning the tide in our favor, or favor of people who say this is a real thing worthy of scientific investigation?
One area is what I mentioned before, the children who remember previous lives. That's absolutely that. The remote viewing work that's been done, which shows not only that there's a real effect here, but there's application, real world application here, and it's being used by people in various industries still. I think that there's so much good evidence from that, even, including from the Stargate program. And that's all accessible by the average person now. So that's there. I'd love to say that there's some macro PK experiments we could do where we could be sure of, but we need performers, and we don't have them at this point. However, healing research is an important factor here. And John Kruth at the Rhein Center has been doing research looking at the energy that the body gives off, specifically looking at biophotons, which is an area of research that not only parapsychology is looking at, and how that might relate to healing. That's what we are looking at. So those are really interesting areas. I'd like to see some research done that has been done individually by some doctors with psychics who claim to be medical intuitives. Barry Taft himself claimed to be is a medical intuitive. And these are people who can seemingly psychically scan your body and at least tell the doctor where to look. I worked with a psychic years ago at the American Society of Psychical Research who worked with doctors at a couple of hospitals in New York City, both as doing diagnostics and also doing healing. The healing he was not so personally big on, because he actually felt the placebo effect on the part of the ill person was working as much as anything else. But the diagnostics, he would often be called into cases that were baffling a doctor who didn't want to launch the entire battery of tests for whatever reason. And I understand, those are expensive for hospitals to do and expensive for insurance companies. And imagine if somebody could tell the doctor, start here.
Yeah.
And that's all I have to say, start here.
Yeah, and maybe I know you said it sort of in jest about the skeptic who was worried that everyone would become adept at ESP overnight, but maybe there is something to that idea that a critical mass can reawaken a latent talent in humanity in general, the whole 100th monkey idea and all that.
Honestly, it still wouldn't allow people to read other people's minds.
Well, no, not that to that extent, but maybe reawaken.
Yeah, I think honestly, I worked years ago on a TV pilot for a game show on the Game Show Network called Telepathy. And they brought me in after they'd already done a pilot, which was too unpsychic, according to the producers. The Game Show Network folks wanted some degree of real psychic stuff in the thing. So I came up with a couple of games and some tweaks. And what we saw in the week we were doing run-throughs, because we didn't shoot the final one, we actually did a live game run-through for the execs of the Game Show Network. They found people who claimed they had a psychic connection with each other, whether they're related or not. And we saw them getting better throughout the week as they saw other people doing well. That was reinforcing them being
competition.
Yeah. So it was kind of blew everybody away at the end, to the point where the original production idea was to offer $20,000 per episode per day. And I said to them, do you want to really give away that kind of money? I think you should get a good sponsor. I think you should cut it back to 10. Because you're going to find after a couple of months of people watching from home, people are going to be able to do this better. And that's, if the way to make it accepted is to have the public accept it as normal, not paranormal. This is a normal thing. And if it was acknowledged by the scientific community, honestly, that's not going to make the difference. The game show didn't happen because of a change in the regime at the Game Show Network. The president was out, somebody else came in, didn't want it. And I think things like that, if you can produce something in a popular way that the average person can relate to, that's a lot better than if scientists say, okay, we accept this, unless they start funding all sorts of research, which also would not happen overnight.
Yeah, good point. I mean, it needs to be done organically, maybe, and not have an authority tell us, whether you're talking about UFOs or aliens or
right.
Bigfoot or whatever things that you're waiting for some sort of official confirmation that probably will never come for various reasons. It needs to be done by average people who learn it for utility, or they need to just reawaken it in themselves. And that's kind of what I think that we hope for, people like us who are looking into these things and really devoting quite a bit of our life. Well, I mean, Loyd, you've devoted how many decades and so much mental energy expended, but it's interesting, and that's what keeps us going.
Right. Yeah, that's it.
So one final question for you, Loyd, and then we realize there are other things to do besides talk to us. So I think in your resume, you said you're a chocolatier. Is that correct? Or do you do you manufacture your own chocolate? Can we?
So I started, because I had such an interest in chocolate in the early 2000s, I actually started doing chocolate tastings, which I do continue to do, although not so much virtually right now.
Yeah.
So I guide people through chocolate tasting events. I ended up doing research for a book, which got sidetracked, and then the publisher went out of business, and it's just a separate thing. But I did, in the process of interviewing people, one of the great chocolatiers here in the Bay Area, Joseph Schmidt, told me that I should really learn myself how to make chocolate. So I took a course got a certificate as a professional chocolatier. I did start manufacturing, making my own, and selling some for quite a while. But then I didn't have the time, money, or energy to put fully into that business, which is what I really would have needed to do to really amp it up. I was making a little extra money on it, but frankly, it was just, for me, great to spend day in a commercial kitchen being meditative, making chocolate. That was a great thing. I still make chocolate truffles, and solid chocolates for friends for some occasions. My business was called Haunted by Chocolate. I still have a website up called hauntedbychocolate.com for that. But I mainly focus on doing the chocolate tastings that I've done, and actually did a webinar recently on how to make chocolate truffles the easy way.
Cool.
Yeah, so I make use of it in my day job also as well. So it's kind of a fun thing.
Well, I'd like to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be on with us tonight. It's kind of like taking your class. There's a wealth of information to learn about in the area of parapsychology. And so maybe hopefully we can coerce you into coming back again and sharing some other thoughts.
Okay.
Is there anything else that you wanted to ask Loyd before we let him go?
No, I think we summed it up. We ended on chocolate. That's as good a place as any, I think. But Loyd has a lot of resources to look into. We'll put up some web links, and
Got books on Amazon.
Book images and some, links. I mean, I'm sure it's centralized on what is the website address that people should go to get to your books and classes and all that?
Currently I don't, my website's down.
That's right.
Yeah. So people can follow me on Twitter at Prof Paranormal, or you can look me up on Facebook, and I have a author page on Facebook. Just remember it's Loyd with the 1 L, Loyd Auerbach. And you can also find my Amazon author page pretty easily just by finding one of my books. And they'll take you there, including the novel that I co-authored, mystery novel that came out last fall and first in a paranormal mystery series.
Branching out into chocolate and fiction. That's, well,
what's the name?
The whole spectrum.
What's the name of the novel?
Yes. The novel's called Near Death.
Near Death, okay.
Appropriate. Investigation.
Okay, we'll look for that.
All right, well, thanks, Loyd. I appreciate it. Great conversation. We could probably go for 4 more hours, but we will let you go this time and hope to meet again and talk about some of this stuff. It's fun.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Loyd. Good night.
Okay, good night.
Good night.